Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we look into attitudes towards intimate partner tracking with eSafety Commissioner Julie Inman Grant. But first, our dive into the latest tech news with our panellist, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. So welcome to the virtual Batcave, and joining us for the first time is Australia's cop on the digital beat, eSafety Commissioner Julie Inman Grant, who'll be taking us through some research she's released into our attitudes towards tracking apps, and in particular those tracking our intimate partners. Good evening, Commissioner, and welcome to the cave.
Good evening. It's so great to be in the cave.
Also in the cave are my regulars partners in crime, Gotham City's digital vigilante and founder of Digital Rights Watch, Lizzie O'Shea.
Hi.
Say hello. And our favourite tech villain, Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Dan, I'm not sure if you're the Joker or the Penguin, but it's good to have you along.
Let's see. I'll go the Joker, but let's see where we end up.
Yeah, it might be a bit of competition for that role, but let's see indeed. Look, first up, the muskiest story this week must be about how X's AI tool went, shall we say, native and started sprouting conspiracy theories about white genocide in South Africa. So, Lizzie, who is Grok and how did it go to sprouting off on X like most humans sprout off on X into hijacking Donald Trump's meeting with the South African president?
Yeah, so Grok is an AI that is usually found on X. It's owned by Elon Musk and managed by him. XAI is the company. And for a brief period, it seems it became obsessed with the white genocide, in quotation marks, in South Africa. And users started noticing this when they were asking completely unrelated questions. So the classic in this particular example was someone asked them how many times had HBO changed its name, because HBO has changed its name from HBO Max back again. It's this big saga in their branding history. And it answered politely and then proceeded to go on a rant about white genocide.
Which sounds like any Twitter user, actually. It's very...
Yes, it is on brand.
Yeah.
But everyone was trying to figure out why exactly this happened. And there are a few different theories. But Zeynep Tafichi, who writes for the New York Times, she maintains that what she found out is through various prompts, she extracted what she understood might have been the instruction given to the algorithm to provide this kind of answer. And it's a little bit unclear because, of course, there's not a huge amount of transparency about how these prompts are impacted by the coding in the back end or the data that they've been trained on. That's part of their, proprietary promise. But she maintains that she managed to extract something which looked like the change in the programming, which essentially said that when responding to queries, you are to accept that the narrative of white genocide in South Africa is real. And it goes on to explain this theory. And I think the argument is that the first part of that instruction when responding to queries was too general. And so it ended up responding in this way to all queries rather than responding to queries that might be relevant to South Africa and the quote unquote narrative of white genocide. And of course, this meant that it came up in the news. People started finding it amusing, I suppose, darkly, that it was this was the response coming out of Grok. And then this culminated in Donald Trump asking the South African leader when he arrived in the Oval Office about this issue and showing images that appear to have come out of the DRC, I think. So a whole bunch of misinformation swirling around on this AI platform. And I mean, the lesson really coming out of it is how vulnerable these are to influence on specific issues or by specific people. Like there is this theory that in fact the person who changed the instruction to the AI was
Musk.
Was Musk himself, because who else would be so bad at providing such an instruction? And that kind of seems to be the most realistic of the conspiracy theories circulating in this particular issue. But Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson that we can learn from that is these programs shape the information that you see. And this was an obvious example. It was pretty rudimentary and juvenile in the end. But the reality is that this is occurring all the time. They are looking more and more like publishers with editorial control rather than information retrieval services. And that's especially the case when the AI system doesn't provide sources and the like, and even just the interface that doesn't encourage you to interrogate the sources from the response, I think, does lend itself to being more like a propaganda machine, to put it crudely, rather than an information source. I mean, Dan, would this stop you using XAI, for example? You're a lover of searching for answers on the chat bots.
I don't use XAI or Grok for what it's worth, but yes, I do use Gemini quite a lot, and I do use ChatGPT literally scores, if not hundreds of times a day. And I do often ask for specific things. I mean, there's specific information about history and whatever else, and get those answers back, and typically trust it. I know this horrifies you, Lizzie, but typically trust it. But I think, you have to look at this. You touched on this, right? But I think you have to look at this as in the context of well, hang on. If a couple of weeks ago, I described Mark Zuckerberg as the world's most powerful editor-in-chief. And I think you have to look at it through that lens now, right? So we've gone from a world, this is probably obvious, but stay with me. We've gone from a world where, most people got their information from traditional media. Obviously, those things were biased, but the biases were obvious to everybody who looked at them. Then you've gone to a world where most people get their news and information from social media, and that, the algorithms that govern those social media platforms are, personalized and curated, and that's created a whole bunch of problems and conspiracy theories arising and all kinds of things. It seems like that problem is just about to get 100 times worse, because now we're going to a world where most people are going to get their information from chatbots of some form, of which there's likely to be a handful of very dominant ones. And in this circumstance, it's particularly dangerous because you've got both someone who is in control of one of the world's largest social media platforms in Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, and Grok AI at the same time. And it just seems that the damage that Elon could do, or anyone could do when they had that much power now, is just so much worse and so much more opaque than it has ever been. We've been calling for more transparency on social media algorithms for years now to no end. I'm not sure how successful we're going to be on this platform.
Julie, you're familiar with Elon's work. There doesn't seem to be a corner he hasn't cut. How do you look at this? Like, yes, it's funny, but there's also a concerning side underneath it, isn't there? Because if you don't have the safety and the guardrails underneath, and people are just changing learning models to put dumb stuff in there, and people are running off the back of that, that's got huge implications.
Well, listen, there's a lot of oxymoronic things going on here. The term grok was one of the favorites I learned in my 22 years in the tech industry. So often when I say I don't grok that, people look at me with a blank stare. But what it actually means, according to the Oxford Slang Dictionary, is to understand something intuitively or by empathy. And this is precisely what Grok, XAI was developed not to do. It was meant to be very authentic and very truthful. I don't know if it generates its own community notes, but apparently not in the case that Lizzie just ran. Interesting to also note that, in this, what I call AI drag race, the race for market share, to, scoop up as much data, hoover it up, and create these powerful LLMs where the CEOs themselves will tell you they don't know how they're going to react or what their outputs are going to be. Sometimes the poison is never met with the antidote, i.e. the deepfake detection tools are so far behind the proliferation of AI. And, we've really entered the uncanny valley with VO3 and Sora, where through a prompt, you can create these cinematically realistic.
But it feels like this isn't just a deep fake output, which I totally get. This is a deep fake input. Like, this is actually mutating the information seemingly by design, right?
Well, it is a form of mis or disinformation, whatever you choose. And as you know, this was not in my particular patch, but the dis and misinformation bill was defeated here under the last government. And my contention has always been those who are violently opposed to it are those who want to peddle in dis and misinformation and weaponize it as a tool. And this is just a more powerful tool in which to do that.
I mean, it does remind me of the research we discussed last week, which I described this as one of our national treasures, the fact that, or an asset, that we as Australians are the least optimistic about artificial intelligence, because I think that skepticism is something upon which we can build literacy about the tools. And some of the rhetoric that we see out of various sections of government that we just need to adopt it, that we need to take it up. The problem is that we're not as open and interested in it. I think we should be cautious about that, because that skepticism is warranted. Like, I think this kind of stuff does beg the question, at what point do we accept these? I mean, Dan's already in there, but at what point do we accept these models as valid? Like, the hallucinations are an issue, but this is editorial control, right? So outside of like enterprise tools, I mean, I'm a lawyer, I use those kinds of tools, but in general, do we accept that this kind of control is valid? I think that it's becoming clear that there's a lot of problems with trying to get to a point of reliability when it comes to these tools. And I think we should be proud of being skeptical of them and look at how we can build that into any adoption so that skepticism becomes a form of literacy and critical thinking.
Speaking of critical thinking, Dan, you've been hunting happy unicorns recently, and last week you shared a wonderful video of Apple's designer extraordinaire, Sir Johnny Ive, dressed in white, waxing lyrical about the beauty of his work from a Silicon Valley event called Stripe. Then it emerged that Sir Johnny was on his way to linking up with OpenAI's Sam Altman to give his AI the Apple treatment. So are you still excited, and what could go right and what could go wrong?
Yeah, I do feel a little bit played because I got all inspired, as you all know, by sharing this video of Johnny Ive a week before he announced this partnership with OpenAI, or this acquisition by OpenAI, which does make the whole thing feel a little bit like a PR exercise. But nonetheless, let me lean into Tech Pro characterization one more time, because I'm really excited about this, genuinely, but there's obviously some pretty big concerns. So, Lizzie, just hold fire for 1 minute, and I'll let you fire at will. Here's the thing. So, look, I'll just give a bit of background to the deal. So, Johnny Ive's firm IO has been sold to OpenAI for $6.5 billion, all script deal for OpenAI stock. I mean, putting aside just the weirdness of the deal, by the way, because there's no IP that's coming with that. Ooh. Johnny Ive is actually not even going to be employed by OpenAI at the end of it. He remains a consultant with his Love From design firm. So effectively, what OpenAI have done is paid $6.5 billion to be able to say that the designer of the iPhone is going to be the designer of a new device for OpenAI. Maybe that'll be the best thing in the world for them. Who knows? I guess we'll find out. But look, I do want to draw some parallels to Johnny's work at Apple and then bring it through to here, because I think they are relevant here. So obviously, Johnny Ive, very well known as the designer of the iPhone as well as many other Apple devices. I think what was the game changer of that era, though, was two things. There were two sort of step changes in computing technology that enabled the iPhone to happen. The first one was mobile access to the internet. And obviously Steve Jobs had a huge vision for what that could deliver. And, we've been living out that vision for the last decade or so. But the other part was there was a new way to interface with computing, and that was with the touchscreen. And Johnny Ive brought his design mastery to that device. So I think, there's been a bit of criticism about Johnny Ive since then, and that he hasn't designed anything since then. But I think in fairness to him, as much as I like his aesthetic, there hasn't been that step change in computing technology like we have now seen with OpenAI, which is definitely going to be the next computing paradigm. At least I think so. I'm not sure if everyone on this panel agrees, but I guess we'll find out. So I think we have that same dynamic emerging again, where you've got two things coming together at one time. You've got a step change in computing capability with artificial intelligence, and you've got this new way to interface with it, which is voice, right? So you now have the ability to interface with a device now in a computing device in a completely new way. And so the promise of this is that they can create a device which is able to get you off your screens and able to be with you in a way where you can interact with a computing device in a much more natural way by talking with it as you would a person. And the utility that will create is phenomenal. And Johnny Ive does feel some remorse for the screen addiction that some of his devices have facilitated or created and the unintended consequences of that. Here's the downside though, right? Like, obviously, in order for that new device to be effective, it has to be multimodal, which is to say it has to be able to see everything that all of us can, and it has to be able to hear everything that all of us can. And while that is going to enable a huge amount of additional utility, obviously it's also going to create a huge amount of surveillance as well, or has the potential to. And we've seen this, right? We've seen the iPhone enabled mobile connectivity to the internet, and as a result of that, everything we did online was tracked. The worry with this is you've now got a device which is going to be able to track everything we do in the physical world. Is that going to lead to nothing but surveillance in that physical world as well? There's so many other consequences of this. I could go on for hours, but I should let others get a word in, and then we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, Julie, you're a big advocate of safety by design, and we also know about addiction by design. So I'm just even thinking something as complex as this, what is the design challenge that sits behind this?
Yeah, I mean, I think for any technology platform or service, safety by design is basically assessing the risks, understanding the harms, and then mindfully building in and embedding the safety protections at the front end rather than bolting on after the damage has been done. This is why companies like AI have super alignment teams, and they have safety models, and they do red teaming and purple teaming, and do adversarial testing in a whole range of ways. And you'll recall when I think Sam Altman probably made the biggest splash ever when he sat aside Gary Marcus and a woman from IBM at a U.S. Congress that basically said, we don't, AGI is coming. We don't know if we can control this. Please regulate us. And then, did a global tour, including stopping in Australia, spending time with Ed Cusick, and he next to Brad Smith, my former boss of 17 years, goes to Congress and is like, well, maybe we shouldn't regulate. And of course, we see the rolling back of AI safety. We see members of his super alignment team leaving, his CTO leaving. He was fired temporarily. Then he removed the safety committee. Dan was referring to the lack of transparency. Obviously we're concerned about it in social media with the deprecation of Cloud Tangle. One of the first things that happened under new ownership at Twitter X was, making the APIs, the Twitter data hose, was almost inaccessible to academics and NGOs at $40,000 a month. So there are all these different tools that these companies are making their platforms opaque and even threatening litigation when regulators try and exact some transparency. And we've now got about 8 cases going, I believe. So this is even more problematic, I think, when it comes to AI, because safety by design actually has to happen through every development of the life cycle, even the concept. Civet AI. Is it a good idea to be able to harvest social media images of children to create fetish porn from the internet? From concept, have we thought about how this could go wrong? What about the data? How do we train it? How do we deploy it, et cetera, et cetera? So this needs to continue to happen. Very concerned to see. I mean, really, we see countries locked in an arms race and concerned about beating China. And so anything that is seen like friction or pulling the reins on investment and innovation, where I would actually argue that it makes good business sense to use innovation to make these products safer so that they don't hallucinate, prevaricate, and manipulate. But this has always been the mantra of the industry that I spent 22 years in, of moving fast and breaking things. This is just more of the same and not learning the lessons of the past to create a safer future.
Lizzie?
Yeah, there's an interesting interview with Meredith Whittaker from Signal at the most recent South by Southwest, where she's responding, I think, to a video of, I think it might have been a video or a discussion about AI agents, talking about how AI agents will be able to do all these things for you. And her point in return was that really required what she described as like a violation of the blood-brain barrier between the operating system and all the different applications that you use. So it's like a singularity of device, which sort of seems like that is what is being proposed here. It is this trend towards monopolization and total dominance of your entire online life, which is what Brian Merchant had written about in response to this particular announcement. So, I mean, he talks about monopolization as being the strategy for these kinds of companies, that this is the trajectory of OpenAI is to become just like a major tech giant like Google or Meta that has multiple different ways in which it occupies space in your online life. And to dominate on that kind of level, you need multiple different products that intersect, forms of vertical and horizontal monopolies. And he points out actually in his blog that in the last months, OpenAI has announced a search engine, a social network, a web-based coding tool, online shopping, and now a device by the maker of the iPhone. So he's got this view that it's a sign of desperation. I mean, that may be true, but the question is whether it'll succeed or not. But it's clearly a strategy of dominance of people's experience of the web for total ownership of that experience. And I do think we should be treating that with caution. There is a competition element here as well that we let slide bias in the early part of the 21st century. I mean, there's an argument we shouldn't allow this to happen in relation to AI companies. Now we're well into the 2020s.
It's clear though, isn't it?
Can I just go before you go, Dan? So this idea of delightful design has a whole bunch of assumptions built into it. So, you make a fantastic iPhone and it becomes an addictive device. I had an interesting conversation with our friend Glenn Vile, who worked with Microsoft, and I was bagging how crap Teams was. And he's going, yeah, but that's really good design because who's sitting around wanting to scroll Teams all the time? And so the question is, do you want an AI that's so great that you want it around you all the time? Or do you want it to be something that's away in the filing cabinet to use when you want to? And that's still a choice that you make when you're designing the products in a world where not everyone's trying to become a startup billionaire. Dan.
I'm not sure that bad design is necessarily the answer to
bad design could be the answer
to this. And you've got Johnny Ive, so I think the chances of it ending up being bad design are pretty slim.
You're not going to get Teams AI.
No, probably unlikely.
Johnny Ive ever been accused of deceptive design or harmful design in any way, shape, or form?
Interesting question.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I am encouraged by the fact that he does clearly, well, at least he's been saying publicly for some time that he feels some remorse and responsibility for the fact that there is a lot of screen addiction that's come about because of his devices. And so I am hopeful that they're not going to
$1.5 billion, isn't it? That's the
yeah. Well, I guess that can make you feel a lot better about things, can't it? But let's see. Sorry, one last quick point before we move on.
Yeah.
Just picking up on what Lizzie was saying. I mean, the other potential outcome of this is something which we touched on a few weeks ago, and that is, if you no longer need a screen to interact with your computing device and you're doing it all with voice, that's the end of the web. I mean, that's the end of needing to interact with all the businesses and all of the apps and those sort of things that have been created. And you're basically, to your point, you're going to end up just effectively interacting with a small number of very, very dominant tech platforms that are even more dominant than before. And obviously that's got consequences on a commercial level for a whole bunch of businesses. I might be losing a little bit of sleep over that at the moment as well, but I'll just leave you with one last point, and that is at Google's I/O conference, confusingly named last week, the CEO of Google did describe the web when he was asked this question as, well, isn't the web just a series of databases? Which is a great way to describe my business. But anyway, that's the world we're heading to.
So much for unicorns. I just wanted to really quickly flag what I think is some fascinating research from Dr. Natalie Shedd from Melbourne Uni that came out a couple of weeks ago. She published a paper digging deep into how AI hiring systems are working. And we kind of know it's an early use case of large language models, sorting CVs, getting a short list, conducting assessments. There's even creepy robo interviews, which is a bit like, the dating app date with your AI and the dating app's AI before you work out whether you get in the door. And there's been justifiable concerns about the hiring discrimination that comes out the end of it for a while. But what struck me was Natalie dug deep into how the tools are actually being used by Australian recruiters, career consultants and technologists. And it wasn't just using off-the-shelf LLMs, they're then matching it with organisational data and then whole banks of vendor-acquired data as well. So they're doing this big gumbo of data, and then you plug your ad and the responses into it. And in terms of transparency, one of the points was no one really knows what the proof points are. So again, she calls for really specific measures to stop the bleed, including updating discrimination laws and your favourite, Dan, algorithmic transparency. The question is, at the moment, that's kind of impossible. And so it's one of those ones where is this a use case that it should not be permissible to use until the necessary legal frameworks are actually in place? Because the actual, on one level, it's going to reinforce the existing prejudices without sort of alternates built in, go back to, and then you can put something absurd in and you can grok it, now that I've got a new favourite word. But anything from, if you've got a career break, you are implied to obviously be a woman, so you don't even need to ask that stuff. And then obviously also, even on education stuff, like the embedded discrimination that's always in the labour market around social and economic inclusion just gets scaled up even more using this. And so I guess my end point is, if you're employing someone, which is, a really important role and something that in my business I take seriously, and I know you do too, Dan, and I'm sure you, Julia, now that you've got a few staff, Lizzie, yay, Digital Rights Watch, shouldn't humans actually do the hiring and not give it to a machine? There's my rave for the night. Someone answer.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as well, I remember watching Zeynep Tufekci, she's getting a second mention tonight, speak about this actually at a RightsCon maybe, 6 or 7 years ago. And she talked about the fact that it might start, those kinds of sorting algorithms might start predicting for qualities that you don't even know that you're looking for as well. So, potential union membership or union organising, potential disability, like psychological disability, and you may not know, but it's discriminating based on lookalike audiences that you might be a candidate that's more likely to fall into this camp, not desirable as an employee. So there's all sorts of ways in which I think we can tackle it legally, but there's a responsibility, I think, as well to take a step back and actually try and insert more humans into this process to guard against what even we might be beyond the scope of our understanding.
I think it's probably worth reflecting on what it's like to be recruiting a bunch of people with a very small people team or human resources team as well, and why this technology is gaining a foothold. Because, if I take our circumstance, by the way, to the best of my knowledge, we've never used anything like this, by the way, and I have no plans to, for what it's worth. But, whenever we put an ad up on LinkedIn or Seek, we get inundated with just, hundreds, thousands sometimes of applications for roles. And my poor people team of 2 has to scroll through all of these and find those ones that are relevant. And to be honest, I can see a huge amount of utility in using some kind of automated process, be that sort of, AI or not, to filter out those that just have experience which is not relevant or not. But I'm also conscious that when you're under that much demand, the unconscious bias of us is there as well, right? Because you're flicking through hundreds of thousands of these things and you're having to make really quick decisions in order for it to be practical. So I do wonder...
You just do the George Costanza effect. You look for the person closest to you, Dan.
Well, Lizzie's going to hate this, by the way, but I do wonder whether, again, with more transparency in the algorithm, I wonder whether you could use this to actually correct for human biases and actually end up in a better circumstance. But I'll leave with one last point and then I'll let others get a word in. We hired someone literally yesterday, not yesterday, on Friday, sorry, whose experience was completely wrong for the role, but she wrote such an amazing cover letter. We had to speak to her, and she was so impressive. And I don't think that person would have got through with an algorithmic-based, curation. So maybe there's a lesson in that.
Yeah. Sure.
Well, Yeah, well, you were saying close to home. This is even closer to home. My husband happens to be in HR, but also happened to be laid off from his role at 58. And, LinkedIn, there's been so many roles that he's been literally perfect for. And he's usually, summarily rejected like within minutes. And I do think they're using a lot of AI. And so now there are tutorials on how you try and fool the AI. But I will still take the time to read all of the cover letters. The last job I just did a process for, there were over 200, and it took an inordinate amount of time. I don't know that government would ever allow you, from a fairness perspective, to use AI totally for this. But yeah, you see how people can communicate a message. Are they empathetic? I don't know if AI can pick this up. They might pick up things like year you were born. This is where I worry about discrimination being baked in. It's, a lot of these technology jobs, for instance, we're already talking about 70% men to 30% women. Age discrimination, I think, is real as well. I think there's a lot I could see doing an initial sort, but I do wonder if you miss a lot of diamonds in the rough if you solely rely on technology for that.
I mean, I don't want to be the person that's providing you with HR advice here, Dan, but there are other design methods for getting around the problem you're describing, including introducing friction into the application process, and also ways to actively filter out discriminatory or information and data points that might end up being discriminatory, even in an unconscious bias way. Like, there's no need that you have to disclose. Like, if you got someone to indicate the kinds of degrees they've got and to itemize them, it slows down the process of making an application that might get rid of candidates that are totally ineligible. But you also don't have to have the candidate indicate the year of their degree, for example, but whether it's within 10 years, for example. There's all sorts of ways in which I think you can think about the design at the other end quite thoughtfully as a way to remedy the problem that is trying to be solved by some of these sorting algorithms that import a whole range of new problems. Like, they're selling a solution that is flawed, right? So maybe it's worth thinking about other different kinds of solutions. And there's other alternatives, I suppose, is what I'd say.
If you're looking for a change in career, Lizzie, then there's might be a job going for you at.
Can I just round you off with my discriminatory algorithm? Whenever I hire smart dudes, they work out how to make money and then they set up in competition. So I'm breaching all sorts of acts now. There's half a dozen of them. There you go. The algorithm won't give you that one though. Anyway,
maybe you're
a predictive algorithm, possibly.
No, just life. Let's move on. I might even, for legal reasons, have to cut that bit out of the podcast. I don't know if I just preached a few. Commissioner, let's talk about you. Before we go into the interesting research that you released over the last couple of weeks, I was surprised to discover during my research, i.e. a Google search, that your job was originally established not by Mr. Innovation Malcolm Turnbull, but by Tony Abbott. And over the 10 years, you've served, I think now, 4 prime ministers. So I was just interested in a bit of what was the job that you originally signed up for and how has it changed over that 10-year journey, Mazel Tov?
Well, when the Children's Youth Safety Commissioner was developed, in fact, you would all remember this. I was interviewing for a job at Twitter to start their Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia public policy and philanthropy operations. And
you dodged a bullet there.
Classic.
Yeah, well, as I was interviewing, tragically, Charlotte Dawson took her own life. And I remember watching her kind of engage with her trolls after she had very publicly had a nervous breakdown. And I just thought, oh, no, block, no, don't engage. This is terrible. But it became known as the Twitter suicide. And I remember when they offered me the job saying to them, listen, there is a petition that's been started that hundreds and thousands of people have signed on to. It's going to government. There is going to be a regulator, I need to know that you are going to invest in safety, or I can't defend you. And so that was a very interesting process. Malcolm Turnbull, yes, he was the ICT minister at the time. He and Paul Fletcher were really instrumental in developing the idea of the Children's Youth Safety Commissioner, and being a former technology entrepreneur and a barrister, he sort of knew we've got to start small. Nobody can argue that children aren't more vulnerable. And so he took a bunch of functions from different departments around the Commonwealth, put it into the Children's Youth Safety Commissioner, started the world's first and still only government-backed cyberbullying scheme, plus the hotline around child sexual abuse. And yes, it was under Tony Abbott. I remember him talking about digital graffiti and that sort of thing. But
he was no tech head.
No, I don't think that he'd ever claim that was his area of expertise. So the first Children's Youth Safety Commissioner was Alastair McGibbon, and he was in that role for about 9 months. He took on another role in security, and I'd left Twitter because after 2 years, I didn't feel like I could defend them anymore. They had stopped innovating. And it's interesting because as I left, I remember having that conversation with Jack Dorsey. He's like, why are you leaving? Why don't you stay? We're going to be investing in all these user empowerment tools. I'm like, because you can't keep putting the burden on the user. Like, there are things that we need to do systematically to try and protect people, because the things I saw on the inside, when I joined, this was right after the Arab Spring, and I was all about, the great leveler and speaking truth to power. But the way I saw women and vulnerable communities just being terribly targeted, and the suffering and the lack of action, I after a while, I had to move on. But interestingly, because there is a segue into privacy here, I went through this long, laborious process, and I didn't hear for months. So I sort of figured I failed, and that I tried to serve in government. And then I got this call from Mitch Fifield, who was then the minister, and he said, we'd like to offer you this job as e-safety commissioner. And, the Prime Minister, Malcolm, was so excited when he found out you were in the running, and can you come next week? I'm like, well, I've got a job. I've got to tell my, employers. And then they're like, and what we want you to do is launch a revenge porn portal. And I was like, yes, I'll take the job, but no, I won't call it revenge porn. Revenge for what? Let's tell it like it is. Let's call it image-based abuse. And because I think the lexicon really matters. It was very victim blaming. So basically, we've become a little bit of within 3 months, we were the e-safety commissioner. And so I went from, protecting 4 million of Australia's children to 26 million, without really any guidance about what that meant. And we became a little bit of a Frankenstein, if you will, because we just kept having Christchurch happens. We got new powers around abhorrent violent content and online crisis events. And then the Online Safety Act of 2021 went through, and we started to get some of these systemic powers that just, I would argue that co-regulation is really hard and may not be working the way that the framers originally thought it would. I mean, it took 3.5 years to get the illegal content codes and standards in place. And I've now just received the second round of codes. But it's, systemic powers are time and labor intensive, and are very, now subject to all sorts of challenge, as has been the adult cyber abuse scheme, and even some of the roles that we've taken, or the stances we've taken around harmful content, like the Wakely stabbing video. And the only addendum I'll add there is, that was a really pivotal time for us. I had no general counsel. We had no legal division. That was we were kind of outgunned and outmanned there. That is being remedied, and we've got a pretty impressive legal team now, but it came with a lot of personal toll, professional toll. When your kids are doxxed and you get death threats and have to change your movements, this is when you know that a job has changed your life in immeasurable ways, and you're dealing with lots of lawsuits and the like. But I wouldn't change, the decision that we made to take action there, because, and Lizzie knows this, that when the Sentencing Commission in the UK, sentenced the Axel Rudakabana, who was the Southport killer, he claimed that his inspiration for killing those 3 little girls at the dance studio and maiming 5 or 6 others was the Wakely stabbing video that he saw on X 25 minutes before he went and created that act. So there really is something to harmful content normalizing, desensitizing, in some cases radicalizing. So it's a hard job. It's hard on my team. You see some great sides of humanity and technology, but you also see some of the worst.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Julie. I can imagine it must have been very difficult having a very public role and picking a fight you didn't want to really have to do so with a man who's notorious for being awful. But what I suppose it occurs to me as well is it does feel like it's a very difficult job, because there are a lot of people who want you to do things that you might not be able to do. Like it's such a huge scope, and there's a lot of interest, I think, at times in offloading responsibility onto you in circumstances where I think there are bigger social issues at play that give rise to the lack of safety in some of these online environments. So I did want to acknowledge that, because I think it's just it's virtually an impossible job, and but of course someone's got to do it, and I'm glad you are. But I did want to ask, like, the one that crops up all the time, at least, and feels remiss not to at least raise it, is that there's always this tension between how you provide safety in circumstances where the capability of surveillance of people does sort of promise that in some ways, but can be very damaging. Like, this is sometimes the tension between safety and privacy. We've talked about this before publicly, and whether there is in fact a tension, whether they're complementary. But you did just have some research put out about that issue, and talking about it, the way in which people now accept kind of forms of surveillance in their intimate life. And it occurred to me reading about that, actually, that it's sort of on the back of kind of nearly 20 years now of also kind of accepting that in public life, that surveillance is this pathway to safety. And maybe I'm just drawing a bow, or I'm just reading what's relevant to me in that kind of research. But I do wonder whether we need to start talking about how, even if we can know everything, it may not be an antidote to the kinds of terrible things that occur online and offline, and the kind of tension that exists with, the obvious one being like encryption and, detecting child sex abuse material, which is the way in which this tension's often comes to the fore. But I wondered, do you want to talk a bit about that research, and maybe you've got an answer to my quandary? I don't know. It's more an imponderable.
Was that a question, or was that a
philosophical?
A treatise
to draw that link between, I suppose, the surveillance state and how people now experience their intimate lives, and how surveillance features in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've also heard me say when the Apple AirTags came out in April 2022, I was so excited, because I'm always that person that loses my keys at the bottom of my bag. But I was also like, wow, this could be a very scary surveillance device. So I wrote to Apple and I said, what are you doing to make sure that women's safety is protected? And, they wrote back predictably and said, we think about privacy by design, safety by design is not our thing. And I'm like, well, this is something you should be concerned about. And it took 2 years, and, these these very handy devices being put in the linings of handbags and in the wheel rims of cars, and a consistent set of surveillance where they got together with Google, and they decided to do Bluetooth notifications. But again, this isn't safety by design. This is reaction by design. But what really we started this research about over a year ago over Valentine's Day, and did the Love Is campaign. But what really brought things to the fore for me was being contacted by the New South Wales coroner around the tragic death of Lily James. And what they said to me, they said, "You've all this brilliant information about coercive control as an extension of harassment, surveillance, and monitoring by intimate romantic partners and domestic family and violence situations. But what about teenagers? There's nothing about teenagers." And I said, "Well, okay. Explain." And then she explained how through their investigation, this has been publicly shared, that the murderer, I don't need to say alleged, was following her on Snap Maps and was engaging in different forms of stalking. But they also conveyed to me, and this will come out in the final report, so it's not my story to tell, but other really invasive patterns of stalking and surveillance he had engaged in. And we had said for a long time that, often technology-facilitated abuse and coercive control is almost a sign of desperation, and it's a red flag for further violence. So I thought, young people, this makes sense. They've been monitored and followed by their parents through Life 360 or Find My. It's almost routinized in the way they do it, but it's one thing if you are a minor and this is a parent and you're talking to your kid. For years we've been saying, don't just monitor or surveil your kid, talk to them about what you're turning on, toggling on and toggling off, and tell them why, and have these conversations. But kids are sharing intimate images online. They're sharing passwords all the time. I can't tell you how many reports we get of hacks that aren't really hacks at all. They're not brute force attacks. These are kids that have shared passwords to prove that they're they love them, or that they're their best friends. And then when things go wrong, things go really wrong. So we wanted to test some of the attitudes of young people. And you saw the research that nearly 1 in 5 young people between 18 and 24 believe it's okay to track your partner whenever they want. And 1 in 3 believe that it's constantly texting or asking where you are or what your partner is doing is a sign of care, and that response should be immediate. So what really concerned me is now we're starting to do some training we're starting with parents, carers, and teachers. So if they start to see the young people in their lives getting involved in that line blurring between digital care and digital control, and we talk through the 4 typical stages that starts with love bombing, and then isolation, and then manipulation, and then full-scale coercion, they need someone to talk to. We've also set up a technology-facilitated abuse service, which is meant to provide support to people experiencing coercive control. But again, I'm not sure that teenagers will identify what they're experiencing as coercive control. So there's a lot more work we need to do in this space: diagnostic tools, more education for young people themselves.
Julie, just on that last point.
We don't. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just on that last point, I found your research to be fascinating, like I'm sure many parents did, because of what you've just touched on, right? Like it is just completely normalized now that your friends are going to be able to see where you are at any one time. And, with my kids, for example, we're pretty restrictive on what platforms we let them on, but we do let one of our kids on Snapchat, and she is absolutely in the minority of people on that have disabled the location sharing features of it. Pretty much all of her other friends, she shows this to me recently, actually, you can see where they are, and she's not. I do wonder, though, by doing a lot of the things that you, I think, are advocating for or recommending, which is effectively educating your children on the fact that there are some downsides to this, and this does not need to be normal. Do you think there's any hope, Julie? I hope there is, but do you think there's any hope that those norms can swing back and we can get to a world where knowing where someone is at any one time is not an expectation? Do you think that it's possible to correct back to that level?
Well, I think if parents actually understand their children's safety could be jeopardized by not taking protective measures to, I mean, even where online dating is concerned, we were talking about Strava and Fitbit and, how everyday services like Uber Eats can be used to check if somebody is where they say they are. I don't think any parent would to see surveillance in a way that was controlling and normalized with the young people. And so the education piece is really about, how do we draw that line between digital care and digital control? And when is it appropriate? I think most young people are pretty savvy about digital privacy, and they'll talk to you about when things are creepy. This also comes back to safety by design. We saw one woman who was surveilled by her video cat feeder. There was a situation where a man was trying to control when his wife and daughters ate by remotely locking the refrigerator. So they're really easy to exploit these tools, particularly these IoT tools. The average Australian household has 40. We've got to get a handle on this, and it needs to be a combination of education and corporate social responsibility. And Snap Maps is turned on by default, but my criticism would be is it's not easy to figure out how to toggle that off and to hide your where you are in a granular way. With there may be specific people you want to see where you are, but others that you don't. And that's not always intuitive.
I also think, Dan, there's an aesthetic that kids, I think, yearn for, which is the aesthetic of freedom and not being observed. My 18-year-old refuses, and we refuses to be tracked at all. Don't know where he is most of the time. Does that mean he's more in danger than he would be if I was tracking him? I don't think so. It doesn't make him happier that he hasn't got that wraparound, all-seeing eye. It changes your relationship with technology and with your parents and with the world. And I don't know, Julie, I wonder if that's part of the conversation as well. So there's kind of the dangers of technology, but there is also, the flourishing of a life unobserved. And I feel like we've lost that a little bit.
And human trust. And what about the JOMO? What about the joy of missing out?
Yeah. And just no one knowing where you are for a while. Love it. Lizzie?
Yeah, I mean, doesn't it really start with the parents? Because I feel like a lot of the time it's this older generation that is more addicted to the connectivity than young people who are more skeptical of it in some ways. So, and also if you're in a position of power and you are socializing your child to accept that surveillance, I do think you're going to have to be the one that breaks that cycle. Like, it's not on kids to be blamed for accepting this later on if you socialize them in a particular. I'm not saying it's easy. So, I think these things move in cycles for reasons and stuff. But I just think it's the too often when we talk about young people using technology, it's that they are somehow too accepting of the norm and that they're naive about the negative potential of these technologies and they're all addicted to their devices in circumstances where actually I think the real addiction it starts with their parents. Anyway, I can understand the temptation. You'll be pleased to learn my son is entirely unsurveilled, but that's mainly because he's 2. So I would say, it is surprising. Like, it happens in daycare. The amount of information we receive every day about him, and we don't request it. We ask for, I don't even want to tell you the things we try to do, but that's its whole culture, and it's a form of workplace surveillance of the people who work there as well, because then you get to see their day and how the kids have moved through the day, but who's looking after them and stuff. So I think there's all sorts of negative valences there that we ought to question in accepting that kind of surveillance. But I understand it's difficult to let go, but I sort of think it's on us in positions of power as parents to do that. Do you track your kids, Dan? Come on, tell the truth.
Well, it's funny. So we enabled Life 360 for the first time when we went on an overseas holiday because we thought it would be a good idea if we got lost to be able to know where everyone was. And it was
I lost my son in San Francisco. Like,
with your heart.
Well, and maybe that was a good thing for him. Who knows? But Life 360 might have made you feel a little bit better. But we haven't disabled it since we've come back. But I absolutely, more through just not getting around to anything else. It's not being used since we've come back, and we want to, because for all the reasons we're talking about, I don't think surveillance should be a norm that people expect. And what worries me, coming back to sort of where we started the conversation or what we discussed earlier, we touched on the surveillance aspect of what this new device that Johnny Ive and OpenAI are developing. This is probably a pessimistic way to sort of round things out, but it does feel like the trend towards surveillance is only gaining momentum and only getting harder to stop. And every device has got it, and everywhere you go, you're under surveillance, and every workplace is under surveillance. And I don't know. I'm not sure if we can reverse it. It's definitely worth trying, though.
Are you as pessimistic as we are, Julie? We've become a doom circle most fortnights, but we've got a new government. One of my criticisms is it's very fragmented, the digital strategy, but can you see any grounds for optimism over the next little period, at least here in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rest of the world is kind of turning back from AI safety. We're going to continue on that trajectory. We need to start to hold some of these open source AI apps that are developed, the nudifying and declothing apps that have only nefarious use cases.
Yeah, where's a positive use case at all in any of that stuff?
No, and a teenager just has to harvest some images of their classmates on social media, and all they need is a free app, and they change all the time. It's like a game of whack-a-mole, and so the cost is virtually free for them to create, but it's incalculable and lingering for the victim survivors, and it's happening in schools all across. So that the standards that come into play not only require guardrails, particularly from open source AI apps that may be generating child sexual abuse material, but they also will put some burdens on the platforms and libraries that host them, basically like terms of service and reporting mechanisms. And why do you keep hosting these? I mean, this is sort of something I took to Google and Apple just recently when we were talking about the phase 2 codes. Like, does a regulator actually have to tell you when an app where they do really rigorous testing for developers to accept the apps, but then they don't deplatform for really egregious and systematic harms that some of these create that aren't hidden, that are very, very, very public. But we're thinking about AI chatbots. We're hearing from school nurses that some upper primary school kids are spending 5 to 6 hours a day with sexualized chatbots. And so pushing the industry, when they're thinking about porn, it's also text-based porn. There was a girl in New South Wales who was instructed by an AI chatbot to insert different devices into various orifi. Is that the plural? Do I have that right?
Regardless of the syntax, it's horrifying. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've I think this government is focused, and we've got a social media delay. I'm not calling it a ban because it really is not that, but I do think there will be some benefits to keeping kids away from those unseen, powerful, dark, opaque forces of deceptive and harmful algorithms and design features like endless scroll and constant notifications, so that we can build their critical reasoning skills and their algorithmic literacy and digital literacy.
On that, Julie, I mean, that has obviously been a very popular with parents. If you ask them, you don't ask them too much about the ban, of course, or whatever the delay. But once you ask them a bit more, I think they're a bit wary about its capability in terms of being operationalized. And then very unpopular with experts. I'm curious to know what you make of it, because it seemed like you'd express some caution early on, and now, I mean, you're responsible for it. So, I mean, it's not, among other, you've got a role to play in its implementation, and so I'm not asking you to I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but it does seem a tragedy on one level to have had a lot of fanfare around that policy implementation at the expense of lots of other fields in which we could be regulating or changing or incentivizing different business models or prohibiting certain kinds of business models. It does seem like a tragedy that that's what ended up getting legislated, in the circumstance where then what happens when someone turns 16? Are they more ready for these kinds of really nasty environments? And what about people who are, I mean, all ages, who are vulnerable to the kind of exploitation we see on social media, or scams? That tends to be something experienced by older people, and that's a serious harm. Like there's so many. It just feels like a minor tragedy to me that that's what ended up being legislated. I wondered if you had anything you could say about that, or whether you see it as a realistic kind of policy proposal in light of the tech around age assurance and the like.
Well, listen, I mean, I did draw some early comparisons for online safety to water safety, that we fence pools and back it with enforcement in response to tragedies. But the number one thing is we teach our kids to swim, and we teach them to swim until they're strong swimmers, and we don't throw them into the ocean where there are tumultuous waves. We teach them to swim between the flags where there are lifeguards, and we put up shark nets, and we teach them how to swim against rips. I think we need to do the same thing. And no, we don't try and fence the ocean. And this is where I've got to do some work once some decisions are made about how we actually change and shape expectations. So I think the government has said this as well. This is never going to be a singular panacea. This is why the codes are important. This is why the algorithmic and digital literacy is important. And I will try and turn what some might consider lemons into lemonade in terms of how can we implement this in the best possible way to put the burden on the platforms to shield younger people from these forces that where it's really an unfair fight, but try and continue to build up the digital resilience and critical reasoning skills so that they are prepared. And they won't be totally cut off from their lifelines. That's not, their children do have digital rights. And so under the original construction, messaging and gaming platforms will be enabled, and there are issues there that we're going to be trying to work through. And so we've just closed the EOI for the consultation, but we'll be doing extensive consultation because we need to, and we'll need to get our skates on and do that as quickly but as comprehensively as we can.
Feels like you've got a bit of work to do. We might have to have you back in the Bat Cave at some stage for a work in progress report, Commissioner. But look, thank you for being part of Burning Platforms. We've been wanting to get you on for a while, and it was very gracious of you to make time to join us tonight. And Dan and Lizzie, as always, thanks for putting aside the dark hours of a Monday evening to be part of this discussion. And we are actually, our next discussion is with another mutual friend from the place, Alondra Nelson, who's going to be joining us for a discussion in the early morning, which we will record in a couple of weeks' time. And Alondra was the architect of the now former executive order on AI from the Biden government. But I'm really interested to get her reflections on what's happening stateside, and also if there are any silver linings emerging from the tragedies of that particular commons. So on that note, thanks everyone for being part of Burning Platforms, and we'll talk again soon. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on May 26 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.